AZU, Pacific Grove, California. It is Monterey Bay Public Radio. My name is Mae Brussel. Before I begin the program, I'll say that the views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo staff or board of directors. We thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that helps bring you the following hour of World Watchers. The following hour of World Watchers is also made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. The name of this broadcast is World Watchers. As I said, I'm Mae Brussel. It is program number 833, November the 23rd, 1987. The anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy just went by this Sunday, just yesterday. I didn't even mention it on the program. I usually dedicate at least 1 hour a year to the assassination of John Kennedy. But all of my research started the day that John Kennedy was killed, and I consider the research that I do every week as part of the investigative work of those people who are behind the murder of John Kennedy. They connect in one way or another, or I wouldn't be using the material in the first place, and I often make the connections that are not so obvious for you. And in remembrance of John Kennedy's assassination, I've continued to study what is called the secret government. Somebody asked me before the program if I had seen that program that Bill Moyers had on television on the secret government, and we were talking about that. Well, that's what I've been studying since 1963, November 22nd. And Bill Moyers, who was press secretary to Lyndon Johnson through those years, and was from the CIA, or possibly could be. I don't know how many people leave the CIA any more than they ever leave the Mafia. Did have a wonderful program for people who want to begin to understand about that secret government that's been going on in this country for a long time. I will do more on the Bill Moyers program in a few weeks, hopefully. He did a very long broadcast on the secret government as far back as 1981, and detailed some of the Iran-Contra persons back in that time period in the Bay of Pigs. So I'll go back to that broadcast and refer to the specifics of how he was detailing this even a long time ago. The Iran-Contra report is out. You can order it from the Superintendent of Documents in Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20402-9325. It's $29 if you're in a hurry. Otherwise, the New York Times is printing it in the paperback for $9.95, but you might go blind reading it, so maybe the extra money would be worth it, because I'm sure it'll be very tiny print like the Tower Report. Also, the hearings are being made available, and I'll mention it for you students of history. This is the way I collected the Warren Commission hearings. Actually, they came in one batch, but these are going to be printed 1 or 2 a month. So starting with the testimony of Richard Secord, that's $19, and Robert McFarlane's testimony is $23 if you're interested in receiving those as they come out from the government printing office. They are available now. Seymour Hersh had a long article in yesterday's Examiner Chronicle titled "Secret Army Unit Aided the CIA Efforts." This is about the Special Operations Division. Seymour Hersh writes in this article about a group called, the abbreviation is DCSOPS, the Special Operations Division, and under that the DCSOPS, a group that wore civilian clothes, unmarked airplanes trained off military bases. The SOAB, the Special Operations Aviation Battalion. There was Jews in Grenada, the Sea Spray Group, unknown until 1985. The ISA, the Intelligence Support Activity. And the important thing about this article, and it's a 2-part article, and I hope Seymour Hersh writes about it, is that these special operation units that link directly to Oliver North have a direct relationship to his Delta Force. And I'll be doing a lot more on this article, the 2-part article, soon. And the Delta Force is the group that Maurice Aquino is a member of from Southeast Asia. And I truly do believe that the glassy-eyed look that Oliver North has in the relationship between the mind control of Aquino and the use of Oliver North in direct contact to G. Gordon Liddy, whose work with the Nazi Odessa will put us smack into the Himmler Castle, into the Pentagon, and the Special Forces. So while I'm not going to do part 3 tonight, I'll continue next week probably to continue the scandal of West Point Presidio, child molestation, the occult in the military, and update that for you, going back to it next week. There are links that can be made absolutely to the Delta Force, to Aquino, to West Point, and then to North and the Delta Force, and Liddy advising North with an instant communication into Liddy's home. And I think we'll end up right with the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, the Odessa. So I just mentioned this article. It was in the Examiner Chronicle yesterday, and part 2 wasn't out today, so I imagine it'll follow very quickly. Also, there was a major article in the San Francisco Examiner Friday, November the 20th, and again, I'm going to spend a long time on it. The title of the report is Iran Reports Omissions. We hear a lot about the report that just came out. The 3 major omissions listed in this article are: 1, the assassination plots. They only mention the plan to kill U.S. Ambassador Louis Tams, and also Eden Pastora, formerly with the Contras. The second parts left out were the drug deals of the Contras, and of course that goes to Felix Rodriguez and George Bush's man, Mr. Gregg, and the allegations of these people. Of course, it goes right to George Bush's office with the drug deals. And the third part is the 1980 arms deals are barely mentioned: the assassination, the drugs, and the arms deals. And Barbara Honegger, who lives in Pacific Grove, has done the most extensive work on the way the election was stolen in 1980 by making a deal, cutting a deal with the higher authorities to hold the hostages until the elections and the inauguration was over, that the hostages would come in return for weapons that would be sold continuously to Khomeini, starting as early as 1981. The deal was cut in 1980. As a matter of fact, this long article has a picture of Barbara Honegger in there, and Richard Allen and Bonnie Sadr, the former president of Iran, who confirms the Honegger allegations of the stealing of an election. And of course, they've been stolen since 1960, when in 63 Kennedy's brains were blown out, and in 1968 when Robert Kennedy's brains were blown in the Ambassador Hotel, those headshots, and then the Chappaquiddick that took Ted Kennedy out of the running, and the shooting of George Wallace, and the shooting, the poisoning of Nelson Rockefeller when he was deep sixed. And the elections have either been blackmailed and literally stolen, or the bullets came. But the important thing is that this is a major front page story on the 80 arms deal that's barely mentioned, the drugs and assassination plots, and a full page on page 4. So here is somebody from Pacific Grove who has pursued this story, wrote it in these times, presented all these papers to the proper authorities, and it looks like there's going to be an investigation in Congress by various persons on this stealing of the election. This investigation took place regarding the Carter papers, but this is worse, keeping the hostages locked up for an extra 70 days or so, and then arming Iran immediately afterwards and keeping the arms flowing. And the new Iran Contra Report says that Oliver North intended to continue to arm Khomeini, even the people that kept the hostages locked up, and the worst terrorists that were involved in killing the Marines in Lebanon, that North was going to continue sending them to arms even when there were no hostages. But the rest of the evening, I just mentioned those briefly because they take an entire hour for each of those sections. I'm going to cover a story which I think is important, that hasn't been covered properly, that deserves the remaining 15 minutes because of the implications. And you may think the story is over, but it has to do with Judge Douglas Ginsburg, his getting out of the capability of being a justice on the Supreme Court. Had very little to do with smoking grass, I believe, and I believe he was an agent provocateur when he was smoking the marijuana at Harvard. He bragged about being the most further right in the Justice Department, and that included Mr. Reynolds and Edwin Meese. And Ginsburg has been embraced by the right wing, the very factors that would know if he were an agent provocateur and what he's been doing since his college days. And they were anxious to reward him, even though he'd been on a judge only 1 year. appointed by Ronald Reagan. They were to reward him with this key position and look the other way. It was some very interesting news people who pulled out the story of his past, and within 11 days, that nomination was sealed up. Now, just before he was nominated, there was a long article, in the LA Times. It was also in the San Francisco Chronicle. Albert Hakim contempt citation is reversed. And this has to do with Albert Hakim not having to tell the investigators or Lawrence Walsh about 8 different foreign countries that were used to funnel weapons to Iran. And the justices that made the decision that favored Albert Hakim were none other than Judge Harry Edwards, Mr. Ginsburg, and Judge James Buckley. Now, Ginsburg and Buckley were appointed judgeships by Ronald Reagan. Buckley was longtime CIA, like his brother William Buckley. He's also a Knight of Malta. He was head of the U.S. Information Agency, CIA. He was made a judge last year, and Ginsburg was made a judge, and they should have disqualified themselves because Hakim holds the secrets to the Reagan administration with his 8 dummy fronts and where the businesses went. So the 2 people, I haven't even checked who appointed Judge Harry Edwards to the bench, but this past year, in 1986, Ginsburg and Buckley were put on the bench. So, of course, they in return protected Albert Hakim and Richard Secord and their Swiss-based companies, 8 companies that are overseas, in addition to the Swiss bank accounts. They should have been out, and then as soon as he made that decision, within 2 weeks, he was nominated to be Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. Now, the Iran-Contra hearings, just from the headlines, give you an inkling of what was going on in the White House, and the very fact that it's so loud and clear about Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese makes you wonder what right they have. Have they earned the right to appoint the next 3 justices on the Supreme Court? This is the next one. And the Bork case was a disaster, and they were pushing harder than anyone could imagine, Reagan and me specifically, to get Ginsburg. So there's things about Ginsburg that forced me to look further into him because of the pressure. The headlines on the Iran-Contra, just some of them this past week, was President let zealots subvert the law, and the chief law officer is named here. Another headline, New York Times, Constitution principles violated. Monterey Herald, Meese may have tried to hide his role in the ransom plan. Another San Jose Mercury, Reagan faulted the inquiry. Reports say the aides hindered the investigation. Another headline, Scandal Probe report hits Reagan and Meese the hardest. And another, in sum, Reagan failed the Iran-Contra scandal resulted from a breakdown of leadership and laws. Another headline, a disdain for government cause for a problem. Another headline, Reagan tolerated climate for scandal, harsh criticism of Casey and Meese. And the headlines go on, Reagan is unmoved that Meese is a bungler. Of course, he's unmoved by that. Another headline, cabal of zealots showed disdain for law. Now, those are the 2 that are going to choose our justice of the Supreme Court. Another special prosecutor focusing on the illegal war out of the White House. Another headline, Meese at the heart of the cover-up. And another one, panel findings leave little doubt that laws were violated. I typed out from the newspapers I take about 40 of the headlines just from last week, and that's the way the story goes. Now, James Kilpatrick, no great liberal, pretty far right, wrote an article about Edwin Meese, November the 13th, called The Blundering Meese. And it says, in the wake of the Ginsburg fiasco, Reagan ought to take a useful step and fire the consummate bungler, Attorney General Edwin Meese. What he did was get a man like Ginsburg, who was doomed by all the other people, to give biographical details that started to pile up. He created a Ginsburg that dropped, and these were all true, that dropped out of Cornell to found a computerized dating service, and I'm going into the dating service. He married an anti-nuclear activist. That marriage ended a divorce. Subsequently, he married Hallie Morgan, an obstetrician who was doing abortions. In 1968, Ginsburg was actively supporting Robert Kennedy's candidacy for president. He assisted as a law clerk to Black Thurgood Marshall. At Harvard Law School, he didn't class himself as a Jew. He was not actively a Jew. In 1980, acquired stock in a Toronto company involving the news media. And this article explains about his role and conflict of interest there. Meese blundered, and this is what the far-right gentleman Kilpatrick said, who loved Edwin Meese and Reagan almost to this point, and the conservatives are mad at them. Meese blundered. That is the long and short of it. He foisted upon the president a nominee who could be depicted as the ultimate bearded hippie of the 60s. The caricature is cruel and untrue. But in this town, perception counts for more than reality. How could Meese have done this to the president? And the answer is, I believe that Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond and Meese and Orrin Hatch knew that all that cover was a agent provocateur from the 1960s, that time period when he went from Cornell to Harvard, and as a Harvard professor, he could be busting people around him, give the image of being a hippie liberal with the black, having a Jewish name, but not a practicing Jew, helping Robert Kennedy, and that's an interesting link. The wife was in the anti-war demonstrations. He had all the bona fides of a liberal, but he also had the bona fides of an agent provocateur that became very useful during those periods when the FBI had Operation Chaos and the Cointel-Program. Edwin Yoder Jr., he's a syndicated columnist in Washington, who wrote for the Los Angeles Times an article called Triumph of Illusion Over Substance in the Ginsburg Case. And he said Judge Douglas Ginsburg's pot smoking indiscretion was a grave disqualification, but he said from the moment Ginsburg confessed to having smoked a bit of marijuana as a college student and a law professor, he became an inanimate department store mannequin. The Ginsburg nomination was from first to last, from hot air alpha to flaming omega, another, in quotes, story to which mere information was almost entirely irrelevant. That when Reagan introduced obscure Ginsburg, October 29th, an East Room media spectacular, the keynote was the judge's special solicitude for law and order, his hard way with criminals, even though he never even had a case, and he was involved in communications and antitrust and business law. And what Yoder is talking about is the illusion over the substance, what was going on. Now, Ginsburg did give some opinions in 1984 on banning public speech on television and cutting off the public access to people whose speeches were irrelevant. And he had a lot of articles in think tank publications on the news media and ways to block the First Rights Amendment of the public, but to give it to the cable television to cut off equal time. And his opinions on the media are important, but the illusion of him as that hippie, pot-smoking, laid-back professor are just an illusion, and that's what I want to go into. Also, there was an article in the Washington Times on Ginsburg's ties to faith is unclear. He did work as an aide to a black Chief Justice, or Justice of the Supreme Court, rather, but they weren't sure if he was Jewish. His child, is by the second marriage, has a non-Jewish maiden name that the child uses. He's not affiliated with any synagogue, and they try to look up his background as a Jew. He had no known affiliation in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere to synagogues, and the children took on Gentile names, and he has not been seen in synagogues. And I wondered immediately when he was appointed just where that story was going, given the likes of Meese and Orrin Hatch and Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms. It was always Helms and Hatch and Thurmond and Meese who were pushing this person above all others. And you know something had to be wrong because those people are so right-wing fascists, supporting the death squads in Central South America and the far, far right, not the conservatives. Now, the headlines were full of stories. Aspirations of an entire generation may go up in smoke because Ginsburg had joints and smoked marijuana. So they tried to turn it to that so that any future candidates who or political appointees who had had a joint are automatically ruled out. If Ginsburg pays his dues, you pay your dues. And that was, pardon the pun, a smoke screen. Another article, well, I have many on the grass, saying uproar over pot use forces Reagan's court choice to quit. And I don't believe it was the pot choice that forced him to quit. Another, Ginsburg's pot confession has Washington a Twitter, and Ginsburg was the victim of cultural collision. Those are lies important enough for me to spend an hour with you. It wasn't a cultural collision. The pot was probably approved of by the higher up because we don't know who got the pot that he handed out or sold, but there were stiff penalties and prison terms and fees, and I'm sure those people are long gone, still in jail, or can't even remember that he could be an agent provocateur, but thought, oh gosh, when I went to Harvard, he smoked joints with us. Isn't it funny that we maybe got arrested or didn't graduate? And look, he can't even be a justice because he smoked, and we did too, so that's his punishment. It's all equal. Well, don't believe that's what it was about Ginsburg. Another story from the L.A. Herald. President is now victim of his own war on drugs. He only became a victim when some reporters caught up with him, and then the Newsweek and Time magazine, both had articles on this, one titled, "The Sins of the Past, Drug Use Derails Ginsburg's Nomination," and Newsweek, Pot and Politics. And now the head of the FBI, former Judge Sessions, now FBI William Sessions, said that the FBI is going to investigate and review why its 5 background investigations of Ginsburg didn't determine why their agents didn't learn about the pot smoking when the news media knew. And I say, I know they knew about that. They know who was an agent, who was an informer, and they passed it up, but somebody else picked up the pot. So he wants to find out, how do you know we didn't see it? And I don't believe for a minute they didn't see it. And another story, FBI to investigate its own probe of Ginsburg's background. But there were other things in his background that came out that caused him quickly, as I say, within 11 days, to be wiped out. Now, Strom Thurmond was the gentleman who tried in the 70s to deport John Lennon because he was found with some hashish or marijuana in a shoe that was found when he moved from one house to another in London, and he'd come to the United States, and it was a 6-year-old charge, and for that, the Senator Strom Thurmond headed a team starting in the early 70s to get Lennon deported. He didn't like his politics, and he didn't want him around singing or peace demonstrations during the 1972 campaign. But all of a sudden, Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms and the whole gang, Orrin Hatcher, saying it's a great appointment, boys will be boys. That was the 60s. He was one of the gang. And Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese in California were busting people right and left, going into the vans, the cars, the communes. Remember those days, the campsites, breaking everybody's back. And why is it okay to, of course it was okay for the law professor to be smoking the joints, because then separately the people who have it or got the grass from him could be busted and not associated with the professor. So that's the fervor of the 60s when it was terrible to be having the pot, and now these people are saying, well, that was perfectly all right. It has nothing to do with his nomination. Now, there are several articles that came out in favor of Mr. Ginsburg, Douglas Ginsburg, and some that questioned what he was about. The San Francisco Examiner had an article saying he only had experience of 1 year as a judge, but Ginsburg said he appreciated the confidence that Reagan had placed in him. An article from the San Francisco Examiner, another one, said Ginsburg was not taken seriously as a nominee until last minute after serious lobbying by Attorney General Meese. He appeared at the last minute, and when Reagan walked to the podium to announce Ginsburg's selection, Meese was in the audience getting congratulations and handshakes. There was concern about Ginsburg that he wouldn't get the nomination. He was selected, according to all accounts, because Meese prevailed on Reagan to name an ideological clone of Judge Borg. Ginsburg's record is one of rigid adherence to Edwin Meese's style of conservatism. Alan Cranston, senator, said Ginsburg is a surprising choice given his age and his limited judicial experience. They expected somebody more qualified. And Orrin Hatch, senator, said Ginsburg is one of the brightest legal minds. I couldn't be more elated. So the conservatives knew a lot about him, and as I say, he described himself at various times as more conservative than Edwin Meese and William Bradford Reynolds, and that past seemed to wash away. Another story from the San Francisco Examiner said that White House officials had endorsed Judge Kennedy for the job, but Meese insisted that Ginsburg be there. He flew into town. He had been in California for the funeral of his grandson. He flew into town on Wednesday night, and Thursday he went to Reagan, and Thursday morning they had a meeting that lasted 20 minutes, and Ginsburg then was announced as the nominee. This story said Meese, the burly former Alameda County Deputy District Attorney, known for his mule-like stubbornness and profound influence over Reagan, had turned the tide. And when Meese has his mind on something, this article says you have to worry. When Meese says it, wherever he's involved, it's confrontation time. So there was a shift to Ginsburg, and Ginsburg had offices in California for his dating service that I'm going into, that I believe was both the reason he was nominated to be one of the reasons to be a justice on the court, and also the reason he was defeated. It sort of backfired on him. But San Jose Mercury had a story just briefly touching the dating service. Ginsburg founded a dating service in 1960s. It was one of the nation's first computer dating services, and then he went on to antitrust business, and while teaching Harvard Law, he represented Chase Manhattan Corporation in advising them. Well, Henry Kissinger was put into Harvard as part of the Chase Manhattan operation by the Rockefeller family, Nelson and David Rockefeller. John J. McCloy, who helped Kissinger go into Harvard as soon as World War II was over, is on the board of Chase Manhattan, an attorney for Chase Manhattan. And here is Mr. Ginsburg also advising Chase Manhattan at Harvard, from the same place that Henry Kissinger came from, when his military papers say that he went to Harvard University. That's part of his military record. Ginsburg also represented, while teaching Harvard Law School, and they stopped him from doing it, the State Street Boston Corps, the telephone companies owned by General GTE, the Fidelity Group of Mutual Funds. And, of course, the San Jose Mercury said the entry of Ginsburg's dating service, and that's what I want to get to, is clearly the most unusual entry in the resume of Judge Douglas Ginsburg. That was in the New York Times. He left college to found a nationwide computer service called Operation Match. Operation Match has to be a CIA, FBI operation. The Cointel-Programs that were set up in the 60s, just the time that he set that up, the Operation Chaos, those were the names of activities of agencies, not of a 19-year-old who soon gets resumes of 90,000 people on their sexual preferences. Operation Match that opened offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and so forth. Now, I've cited several weeks ago the role of Ronald Reagan as an FBI informer in 1941, and that came out in the New Yorker just October the 5th, 1987. A friend sent me that New Yorker article. I also have mentioned several times that Henry Kissinger was an FBI informer in the 1950s. This information came out in the New York Times in 1979. And Klaus Barbie was an informer for the Gestapo as part of the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium just prior to World War II in 1933 and 34, informing on Catholic youth and students over in Germany, getting information about students. So we have a history that goes through the informer stage that Lyndon Johnson used with his various whorehouses, if you can call them that, entrapment residences. Richard Nixon used them with the Operation Chaos and the Cointel-Program. Hitler had the purple houses, and entrapment of men with women or women with men, whichever were your targets, were a common form of espionage in early Germany, just before Hitler came to power, and certainly through the entire era. And then in the United States with J. Edgar Hoover and Bobby Baker and Lyndon Johnson, and then the Watergate exposés revealed the floating boats, the yachts, that were to be in Miami to entrap politicians with the use of Tony Lasowitz and Herbert Kalmbach, the attorney for Richard Nixon's espionage operations, and also for United Airlines, giving salaries to the likes of Tony Lasowitz. Men and women were used to entrap politicians for getting them later, defaming them, stop their careers, blackmailing them, getting them into important committees, and then pulling out this evidence that would break their political careers. So I'm going to take a 1-minute break. Now it's the end of the first half hour. Remember, at the end of this half hour, you can call the station, and it's your turn to participate for the talk show part of the program. The article, several articles that were of interest to me about the dating service came out, one in the Miami Herald and the other in the Chicago Tribune. And again, another large article that I'll go to that one next. The one from the Chicago Tribune and Miami Herald, November 1st, is titled, Court Nominees Dating Service Was a Success. The senators want to know more about it. And if the senators want to know about it, I say then Ginsburg was through. Now, the gist of the article is that Judge Douglas Ginsburg left college for 3 years. He was at Cornell 1 year. And in 1960s, he started Operation Match, which I say is a CIA title, Operation Match. And it was one of the first computer dating services set up for college students. I had located in the 1960s a CIA Project Resistance, which was undercover activities on college campuses, but he wouldn't use the same name that the CIA used. There was Operation Chaos, and there was Project Resistance, and there was the Cointel-Program, and Operation Match sounds just like that. And one of the stated goals was of Operation Chaos and Cointel-Program, run by the FBI and CIA, was to break up marriages, relationships of politically active students, and it was the FBI reports account for Young Americans for Freedom, Tom Charles Houston, working with Army, Navy, intelligence, all branches of government, and Ginsburg took 3 years off. Ginsburg formed this company first in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with 2 men. In 1965, they expanded to Los Angeles, New York, Chicago. I mentioned those places, and how he then left and went back to Cornell and then to Harvard University. Look magazine in 1966 had an article about Ginsburg's company. Well, I doubt if there's many 19-year-olds going on 20 that get an article in Look magazine, and then New York Times had an article, and that would give it the publicity or push to get those suckers in that might want to participate. And according to Look magazine in 1966, and Ginsburg was just 20, so this had to be older people as a control over him that then in turn could provide his college education to go back and then get into law school. It said there were more than 90,000 applications in the first 9 months. Now, Ginsburg, relatively unknown to people looking into his past as a justice of the Supreme Court, could certainly look into the Look magazine articles, or knew that this obscure person, this dropout, was written up as having grossed $270,000 in 9 months. And how did he make it? Operation Match asked students in 4 major cities to answer no less, this is 135 questions about themselves and the traits they sought in companions. These questions were for premarital satisfaction, fixing them up with dates, and were not for marriage purposes. Now, you know how Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms and Orrin Hatch and Meese would love premarital arrangements where you're given the names of 5 men if you're a woman, or 5 women if you're a man. And at the time Reagan became governor in California, these files were already made up in California also of a list of 90,000 people that could be tapped for certain sensitivity or interest, if you think about that and wonder why Thurmond and Helms and Meese and Hatch just had to have Justice Ginsburg. Now, Ginsburg was interviewed by New York Times in 1966 about his questionnaire, and he said that it was geared toward college dating situations, and it was a college people that were targeted also by the Cointel-Programs and Operation Chaos. And Ginsburg said in his interview he wanted people in their late teens or early 20s, people who want to date, not for marriage, but want to date. And this article continued, he never addressed the social issues in his life like abortion, privacy rights, or wrote anything about in his professional writing. But according to a great friend of his who's a professor of law at Harvard, he said that he wanted this Operation Match because he needed some experience in the real world. So he sets up an office with publicity from the New York Times and from Look magazine, where people will pay $3. They pay the $3. They're not even paid $3 for the information. You send them your $3 and 135 answers to questions. 90,000 suckers are sucked in, and they certainly could continue. The CIA could approach some of them who seemed to be willing to participate in dating, and you could fix some very nice arrangements, pull out possible future agents, and disseminate these people with agents. Say if I'm political, I'm studying history, I'm interested in the Kennedy assassination, boy, the computer could fill out 5 people to send to my house. Now, this was a time period when Tony Lasowitz was working for the New York Police Department, and then he went 6 years in plain clothes with the police department from New York, and he was at the island of Chappaquiddick when Ted Kennedy was knocked out for ever being a candidate for president because of the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, and that cabin was filled with 5 other women besides Mary Jo Kopechne. Who knows how they were recruited or when or how they got on the staff of these political people in Washington. The New York Times and Look gave it a lot of publicity, and this could be good to suck people in, get them into the dating service. And Ginsburg, as I say, never addressed himself to military issues at all, and was doing something as he left college that is totally foreign to him. He wasn't a psychology major. The article that Miami Herald says that Douglas Ginsburg, after going to from Cornell College to then Cambridge, and then with 2 Harvard undergraduates, started studying the compatibility of different kinds of people. Now, he's in corporate law, advising the kinds of Chase Manhattan that was also a cover for Henry Kissinger at Harvard University, and afterwards involved with a lot of espionage with John J. McCloy and those offices. When did he get a proclivity for understanding the compatibility of different people? I believe this was, as I say, a system set up by the intelligence community to suck in these 90,000 people who were willing to answer these questions. These aren't psych majors. They're not anthropologists. They have no background in this kind of activity. The allegations were Ginsburg had to support himself, so he had this service, but this is really a responsibility. Somebody asked for 5 dates, and they're sending names to these people out of a computer. I don't believe it was computerized, except by the intelligence community already knowing men and women that could be useful and target specific people. The headquarters were in New York, and they sold stock to the public at one time. And as I say, for $3, you send in information, and the article says the odds of getting along with a girl are better if she's been screened by a computer. This was the reason for doing it. If you're interested in Renaissance art, you can't go to a girl and say, hello, do you like Botticelli? So the computer would send you someone with Renaissance art interests. And the friend of Ginsburg at Harvard, who still teaches there, Hal Scott, said, to his credit, here's a guy who at age 19 had the presence of mind not to go to school if he didn't know what he wanted and to start an innovative business. He only invested $700 or $800 of his own, came out with more than $10,000. The company had declared bankruptcy. He didn't turn over his $10,000. And this was a period in 1965 to 68, when he goes back to college, of entrapment of men and women for political purposes. And in 1974, at the time of the Watergate hearings and Senator Frank Church's investigation, it came out about the past misdeeds and the entrapment of various people. The San Francisco Examiner had a story, complaints about the computer dating service that Ginsburg helped run. And the punchline of this story is, as the Better Business Bureau began to go into Operation Match, which had moved from Boston to New York, the business suddenly discontinued. People had sent in their money, and the principals had disappeared. Well, he went right on to Cornell. Came from Cornell, had this computer work for 3 years, and went back to Cornell and then to Harvard Law School. So the FBI can find all these labor leaders and people who smoked pot, or histories of other businesses that went bankrupt, and they say, well, we couldn't find Ginsburg. All of a sudden, he's nominated to the Supreme Court, and even the FBI can't find this record of Ginsburg in the past, but some very curious investigators found it. And then this article about the business that he ran said, the Postal Service officials in Boston said they're not certain of the outcomes of the investigation because at least 2 of the investigators have died. Well, maybe there's 10, but at least 2 primary witnesses have died that investigate that. And of course, I'm always looking into primary witnesses who have been killed. The Examiner article on complaints about the computer dating service say they started to come into the Postal Service, and evidently some people were very satisfied with their matches, and other people it wasn't meant to match or do, and it was a dummy front. one blind man requested Operation Match to send the names of 5 dates he could have in his own area, and the Better Business Bureau investigated the computer and found for his $5 that was sent in, his dates were in Ashland, Oregon, Attleboro, Fall River, Fitchburg, Virginia, Saxonville, Massachusetts, and Nashua, New Hampshire. So that blind man was supposed to go to 4 different states and a different city than where he lived. So the Operation Match, the conclusions were that it unduly favored some creditors over others, and the criminals, according to this article, fled town. The creditors left town. Well, there are only 3 people, and one of them was Ginsburg, and the Better Business Bureau began to look into complaints of what was going on, and Ginsburg, as I say, walked away with $10,000, and I believe it was a CIA dummy front, and they didn't even bother answering to the other people, and there are long articles about the computer business, and of course, if these people hadn't found that, these people, whoever did the investigation on the matter, the author of one of the articles, which didn't have an author, was Associated Press Wire Service, were certainly very good in locating this business operation, because anybody having 5 investigations into Justice Ginsburg would have found it and wondered why out of wedlock you're sending 5 luscious mates, men and women, to persons of the other sex, students predominantly, college-oriented, whether the most idealistic and curious about the anti-war in Vietnam. One author was Christopher Drew of Chicago Tribune. The other is the Wire Service. And then the San Jose Mercury says the Supreme Court nominee's rocky tenure at Harvard caused his the closing down of his consulting firm at Harvard. And this article goes into the fact that at Harvard Law School, where you're only supposed to be teaching law school and not running a business, he was the advisor, as I say, to Chase Manhattan. And Chase had their very famous Henry Kissinger on the campus there, who was an FBI informer and worked through Chase Manhattan. And this article tells about how Douglas Ginsburg set up an outside law consulting firm that advised wealthy corporations, and the private practice was against the law. The Harvard law professors, the dean, said that he was skirting a school policy. James Vornberg was the dean of Harvard Law, and that he was going around the law to advise these major corporations, and his purpose as a professor there to take on the corporations as a private company was to tell them how to understand the new laws in Washington so they wouldn't have to pay the taxes that other people do, to advise them on the corporate law or the merger law. That's what he was doing. He was described as brilliant but arrogant, insensitive, snide, condescending, sarcastic. He pushed for conservative views. These are quotations of him from the Harvard class. He stressed economics, too little on law. He advanced his own conservative free market theories. He ridiculed the views of others, and he used the banking laws and advised these other people. And he was described among the worst professors they ever had. Now, this is the guy with the anti-war wife advising Robert Kennedy's staff, appearing as a liberal, helping Justice Goldberg, Thurgood Marshall, and having corporate clients at the same time until the university cut him off. Now, at the time of Watergate, the hearings before the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, Book 1, goes into the testimony of Tony Lasowitz, who worked in New York City as a cop, and he worked in the Special Services investigation, and he worked 6 years without a uniform under the Bureau of Special Services. And Lasowitz used to tickle the Watergate witnesses by telling about his one-way houses with the mirrors, glass you couldn't see through, and entrapping the persons that they targeted for political candidates with sexual partners. And he described himself as a super spy working with the sexual part for 6 years in New York City. And New York City is where Ginsburg had set up his computer service, where 90,000 people were putting information in all over the country about their sexual interests. And these hearings also, I have reread what was going on in the era of 1965 through 68, and Mr. Tony Lasowitz describes how he was a Chappaquiddick. In 1969, at the time Mary Jo Kopechne was drowned, and he was disguised as a newspaper reporter, and he was asking the most embarrassing questions at the press conference about Ted Kennedy, and that involved a woman who was drowned and also a group of women at the house that evening who were partying before the death of Mary Jo Kopechne, and Lasowitz worked with the police department. Also, the Cointel-Program documents show that the targets of the FBI were such groups as those concerned with political activities, legislative activities, domestic issues, Negro questions, youth matters, women matters, cultural activities, and education, educational foundations, and schools and colleges. And this is the area where he's smoking the joints and giving out, dispensing grass, and smoking with them, Mr. Cool Hippie. See, his nomination was turned down because he had grass. It was turned down because when the dating service and the information about the dating service came out, that was the end of him, because those are the things that the FBI would know and the CIA would know and the Defense Department, but we weren't supposed to know. And again, these zealot researchers who are out there finding this information can and do change the course of history. The Watergate hearings describe in 1966 an agreement and coordination between the CIA and the FBI and their involvement in internal security and domestic politics and breaking up various groups that included campuses and colleges. These come out of the Senate Watergate hearings. And during the period, thousands of young Americans and members of racial minorities were busted for civil disobedience and protest and dissent and grass. And the FBI and the CIA were highly involved in domestic intelligence. Just the years when he leaves Cornell and becomes a part of an operation match, again, with a title that sounds just like what I think it is, a CIA operation. He gave it the right title. Now, I want to make a comparison of that to broadcast and information I did, years ago, about 5 years ago, broadcast number 317, and it has to do with a parallel, and it has to do with campus. And I want to share it with you because there's all new listeners here. There was a lawsuit that took place in San Francisco. It had to do with a Charles Winan, W-I-N-A-N-S, versus Rolling Stone. And it was filed in 1978. It was against Rolling Stone magazine because Paul Krasner of The Realist had written an article about the Manson family and the LSD. And again, the Manson now. We'll go into the son of Sam Manson, Anton LaVey, Michael Aquino in the next few weeks, and it overlaps with the type of agent provocateur events that were happening in that time period. Now, this particular person sued Rolling Stone for $450 million because of allegations of the Manson family and where they got their LSD and their drug supplies. It was because of an article that Paul Krasner wrote. The attorney for the prosecution was Melvin Belli, formerly Jack Ruby's attorney, and the defense was Rolling Stone, owned by Standard Oil Corporation. And the primary witness in the $450 million libel suit was Mae Brussel. There was an article in New West, April 16th, 1978, where it describes my role as a primary witness in this case and how these people got tangled into the allegations that Krasner wrote about hippies and Navy intelligence. And Melvin Belli said that Mae Brussel will be an interesting person to have in court. He said she sounds like she's going to be an interesting witness, Mae Brussel against Jack Ruby's attorney, Melvin Belli. Now, part of the court material, I have a letter here where I was concerned that they were moving towards a court date in August of 78, and I had not yet received some material I wanted. And the letter said her concern involves recent revelations by 1978 that military intelligence agents, including naval intelligence officers, were working undercover in various locales and on college campuses during the 60s. Those are campuses across the country. She said the agents worked under the umbrella of Project Resistance, and she feels that the defense in this lawsuit by Rolling Stone should get all the documents on the project through the Freedom of Information Act, and if documents are no longer available or are released in a censored way, it should be possible to remove for the dismissal of the lawsuit against Rolling Stone. And I filled out for Rolling Stone as their primary witness a pre-trial deposition that was only 12 pages long. It was exactly 12 pages long. And in that, I detailed how agent provocateurs, dressed as hippies, who walk on the highways, who have cars in back that they don't use, who smoke the pot, appear like hippies, have a role in changing the fabric arts of our society, of infiltrating those people who are genuine in doing their general activities or smoking the grass, and how these agents are brought into the milieu to have them busted and so forth. And after I gave this 12-page deposition on the case, there had been $2 million in the defense of the case by Rolling Stone and $1 million in the prosecution. And after just 12 pages of the deposition, the entire case was thrown out of court. I also invited on KGO, I was doing a lot of broadcasts with Bob Trevor, I invited the public to come to the court in San Francisco that summer and watch the unveiling, taking the veil off those persons who work and act like hippies, and show their relationship in general and in particular to the police department, to the Navy intelligence, to military intelligence, and also this was related to the Manson family and the drugs. And I said, watch Americana, because only in a lawsuit, a civil suit in a court like this can you ever get these stories. Just as the Warren Commission covered up the murder of John Kennedy, and the Watergate inquiry covered up the real parts of Watergate, and the Iran-Contra has covered up the real part, such as the assassination, the drugs, the 1980 sabotage of the election. It takes a court of law to really get a civil court of law to get into these matters. Now, the deposition that I gave went into my background, where I was educated, how I happened to study these assassinations, how I went into the murders of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, George Lincoln Rockwell, Malcolm X, the shooting of George Wallace, and the operation of the Manson family. And it was that extensive research I did from the moment that Sharon Tate and the 5 others in her home in the LaBianca family were murdered that I got a good handle on the military intelligence operation of Manson, and it is directly tied in to the Anton LaVey and the Church of Set in San Francisco and up to the Pentagon, which is breaking now. And I went into the ways that I had been under surveillance, that there was domestic intelligence of the military, federal government, during the 1960s and 70s. And Judge Ginsburg, who was just a Cornell dropout for a couple of years, was, I believe, was part of that 1965 to 1968 operation. Then I went into the articles I'd published for The Realist, and now I started my radio program in 1971. The background I gave was extensive on my own surveillance, the federal government's use of the state of California, the military domestic surveillance, and the use of the military and domestic and FBI and CIA because of 5 important military installations on the Monterey Peninsula, and my work with trying to study domestic intelligence. And again, this makes me think that the Ginsburg story just reeks of him being part of that operation. And his operation was also in California. And that's where Edwin Meese got the love affair for Douglas Ginsburg for his past work during the years where they accumulated in one year 90,000 names. And he and Ronald Reagan were part of this whole COINTEL operation. They set up the SLA, which I wrote as the SLA is the CIA, and the martial law plans and so forth. And in this article, I described the political activities I had and how we were photographed and involved with the mutiny trial, the GI coffee house, and so forth. And then the persons who moved into town with military vans and trucks who were disguised as hippies, and my experience of them, and they in turn working and writing about witchcraft again, writing a book for the Los Angeles Police Department on witchcraft going to this past period, and how I began to recognize those agents provocateurs, and several in particular, that could be hired to affect the social climate around us. And when I went into details of this case and the CIA relationships to the case and the guns and bragging about skinning animals alive. Again, this is what the occult are doing. The Michael Aquino group that are linked from the Pentagon to the nursery schools, killing animals in front of children alive. And I went into the Manson family, the hippies and the bikers, the so-called hippies and bikers, and filled this affidavit on the social history of how I became familiar with this particular case and the similarities to what happened to my life. I understood them, and I presented this, and the woman who took the deposition for the lawyers, it was in May of 1978, said, "This is the most important or interesting thing I've ever done in my law career." And it was that background that I had that made me familiar right away with when the Ginsburg story broke and all the beginnings that, oh, he had pot, oh, isn't that terrible? He had this grass, that I knew this was a whole lot of malarkey. It wasn't the grass. It was that Edwin Meese's insistence over Judge Kennedy and Orrin Hatch's insistence and Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond. Those people have worked with the AGENT provocateurs. They've worked with the far, far right. They know that illusion of the hippie that was passed off to people, where Reagan thought he could get a centrist vote, to get his judge in. But I did want to cover this. I'll go back to the occult next week in part 3 of the nursery schools, the military operations. I wanted to get the Ginsburg in because, again, the recognition of him with these people going back to years ago to his time period where they were informers. I was very familiar with all that, studied it and lived it, which is worse. And I wanted to share that with you because it's important to appreciate what was going on. Now I'll conclude by thanking Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that brought you the past hour of World Watchers. The previous hour of World Watchers was made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of micro peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. You hang in there, and I'll be back with you in a moment to continue with the second half of this program.